So what is sensory processing, and what is sensory processing disorder? Sensory processing is a term that refers to the way the nervous system receives sensory messages and turns them into responses. We constantly manage sensory messages: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, the 5 familiar senses that let us hear the clock ticking in the background, feel the breeze blowing in the window, smell the bread baking in the oven. We also constantly manage sensory messages from 3 less familiar sensory sources. These 3 sensory systems are sometimes called the hidden senses. First, we have proprioception. The proprioceptive sense, sometimes called prop for short by therapists, lets us feel our muscles and joints. When we stretch or move our bodies, our proprioceptors tell us where our body parts are moving. The vestibular sense provides information when your head moves in space. Vestibular sensations tell us if we are moving through space, if we are surrounded by something that is moving, or if we are on something that is moving. And last, interoception is the feeling or sensation that you get from your body's organs. For example, when you have a stomach ache, that sensation comes from your interoceptors. Everything we do requires us to use multiple senses, often simultaneous. For example, let's take reading. When you are reading, your sense of vision enables you to see the words on the page. Your vestibular sense tells you that you are sitting upright while you read. Your tactile sense allows you to gently touch and feel the page and turn it. And the proprioceptive sense lets you know how much power you need to hold up the book. Most of us are born with the ability to receive sensory messages and organize them automatically into the right behavioral responses and physiological reactions. We never think about it. It just magically happens for us. Yummy bread fragrance coming from the kitchen turns into the smell of something burning. We don't have to stop and think about what to do. We automatically translate the smell message into the behavioral response of dropping the book we are reading and rushing to the kitchen. At the same time, our nervous system produces a physiological response, an uptick in heart rate, a rise in blood pressure, the outbreak of a fine sweat. Those are warning responses from our brain. Hold it, something's wrong, move quickly. That response is called a fight, flight, or freeze response, and we are programmed in our brains to move quickly when we have that danger signal. But what happens if you have sensory processing disorder? Children, adolescents, and adults can have sensory processing disorder. It means that the signals from the sensations are either not automatically felt, or are not well regulated, or are not interpreted correctly. Therefore, appropriate responses to the sensory input do not occur. Keep in mind that not all unusual reactions to sensation are a disorder. SPD occurs on a spectrum from mild to severe. We all have days when we are overly sensitive or oblivious to sensory input, but it is only when daily routines and activities are disrupted most of the time that we say a sensory processing disorder has occurred. Let's say a boy is playing in the park when a batted ball careens towards his head. If the boy doesn't perceive the sensory message that the ball is coming towards his head, and that could mean danger, and if he doesn't duck or throw up an arm in self-defense, he could very well get hurt. If this child consistently fails to organize similar messages, chances are he will have problems in other areas that rely on the same sensory and motor foundations. If the problem is that he can't plan the motor action of ducking, he could also struggle with putting on his socks or making his way through crowded spaces. If he sees the ball coming but can't judge how close it is, he may struggle with spacing letters and words in his handwriting. If he sees the ball and knows it's close but isn't alert enough to take action, it's probable that he'll miss a lot of other important sensory messages as well. As problems like these reoccur in multiple areas, It would be easy for this boy to start feeling awkward, stupid, or just plain different, because he couldn't do the simple things that all the other kids could do so easily. If other children began ridiculing him, he might have trouble making and keeping friends and feeling good about himself. He might say, "I'm just a loner," and give up trying. His feeling, "I'm bad," could turn into hanging out with other bad kids, and a downward cycle could begin. His parents no doubt would become worried or frustrated. No matter what his gifts and strengths were, life would be hard. Children with SPD have symptoms that are chronic and disrupt their everyday lives. These symptoms are detected by interpreting their behaviors. One of the most complex questions is this: is it sensory or is it behavior? This complex question we will return to over and over as we discuss sensory processing disorder. The condition increasingly known as sensory processing disorder was first recognized in the mid-1900s and originally called sensory integration dysfunction. Dr. A. Jean Ayres was an American occupational therapist, educational psychologist, and neuroscientist who pioneered the study of this disorder. In the 1960s, she wrote in scientific journals, and later she published her groundbreaking 1972 book, Sensory Integration and Learning Disorders. Dr. Ayres explored the association between sensory processing and the behavior of children with disabilities. She theorized that when sensory processing is impaired in a child, when there is a sensory integrative dysfunction, social, emotional, motor, and/or functional problems can result. She devoted her career to investigating this theory. Dr. Ayres' brilliant career ended with her death in 1988, but her probing approach and the body of research it produced continues to serve as the cornerstone of study into sensory processing disorder. Dr. Ayres trained a cadre of faculty who are called faculty emeritus now. We taught courses and donated funds to support her research. As for myself, I was one of Dr. Ayres' first students in 1973. For those of you who are certified on her tests, you will appreciate that my certification number is 10. Having been mentored directly by Dr. Ayres for 3 months, I have gone on to continue the research and education and bring questions about sensory processing disorder to national and international consciousness. I told Dr. Ayres that I would do everything I could to research SPD until it became formally recognized by the medical establishment, and so I am. Along the way, I founded the Kid Foundation in 1979, a nonprofit public charity where I directed the research, education, and advocacy efforts. After over a decade as faculty at the University of Colorado Medical School, I left the medical school to found the Sensory Therapies and Research, or STAR, Center in Denver. The STAR Center offers family-centered care for children and adults with sensory processing disorder and other developmental challenges. About 10 years ago, the Kid Foundation was renamed the Sensory Processing Disorder Foundation to more aptly reflect the work that we do. And that brings us to today, where I continue to follow through on my promise to Dr. Ayres to advance the knowledge and research about SPD through the foundation started 35 years ago and through the new STAR Center for Children, Adolescents, and Adults. What does sensory processing disorder look like? It is detected through behaviors. Those behaviors are social or motor, emotional or attentional. They are not sensory behaviors, but they are responses to sensory stimulation. There are children who can't organize their desks, and children who must have predictability in everything down to the food on their plates. There are children who can barely arouse themselves to leave their beds, and children who can't calm down enough to sleep. There are children who have trouble sitting up straight, and children who have no judgment and execute almost dangerous acts requiring extreme motor skills. There are children who fall apart and have tantrums with any scheduled changes. There are other children who do not even notice transitions. So many children, so many behaviors. It would be wonderfully convenient if sensory processing disorder produced one or two patterns of unusual behaviors that always look the same, but that is not the case. There are many different behaviors that signal a sensory processing disorder. Let's look at the three primary patterns of SPD now. These patterns can appear independently, or a person may have more than one at the same time. The first pattern is Sensory Modulation Disorder, abbreviated SMD. It is a problem with turning sensory messages into regulated behaviors. Children with SMD have difficulty matching their responses to the type and intensity of incoming sensory information. Basically, these children are poorly regulated. The second primary pattern is sensory-based motor disorder, or SBMD. It is a problem with core muscle stability and moving gracefully while planning a series of movements. Basically, children with SBMD are either weak with poor endurance or clumsy and awkward. The third pattern, Sensory Discrimination Disorder, or SDD, is a problem with interpreting or giving meaning to sensations. If a person has SDD, they may see a B as a D, or hear the word back and think what was said was bag. What you see here on the screen is the classification scheme that my research team and I have put together to try to explain the complexity of SPD subtypes to you. It is important to understand all the subtypes of SPD and to correctly diagnose the subtype that a child has so that treatment can be targeted to his or her specific needs. These patterns represent our best knowledge today. However, as we and others gather additional knowledge in the future, I'm sure these patterns will be combined or adapted to fit the new data. We do want our knowledge to grow, and as it grows, we will certainly see things in a new light. That means that we must adapt as we discover new information. So we should all look forward to further adaptations of this classification scheme, as it will indicate that we have new knowledge about SPD. In this course, we will summarize each subtype. We will go into greater detail about each of the subtypes in additional courses. For now, let's get to know the primary patterns and the subtypes of SPD in general. Let's start our discussion with sensory modulation disorder, including the three subtypes: sensory over-responsive, sensory under-responsive, and sensory craving. In sensory-based motor disorder, there are two subtypes: dyspraxia and postural disorder. And finally, in sensory discrimination disorder, there are 8 subtypes: visual, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and sensation from the muscles and joints, proprioception, sensations from the movement of the head in relation to gravity, vestibular, and sensation from your internal organs.